I was halfway through a sip of Cabernet when my father's voice sliced through the elegant ballroom, loud enough for half the reception to hear. That's the biggest failure in this family right there. Don't let the confidence fool you. The words landed like a slap. 3 tables turned. A woman in a pearl necklace actually snorted into her champagne. Another leaned in, eyes sparkling with that cruel kind of curiosity people get when someone else's pain becomes entertainment. I didn't flinch. I had spent 22 years in the United States Army learning how to take worse hits than this without changing my expression. But inside, something cold and old twisted in my chest. My father kept going, swirling the bourbon in his glass like he was performing for an audience. You know how every family has that one kid who just never figures life out? That's her. 22 years bouncing around the military and still doesn't have a real career. Some people just aren't built for success. Laughter rippled across the table. Not cruel at first. Just the easy, thoughtless kind that happens when powerful men tell jokes at someone else's expense. I kept smiling, the same smile I had perfected years ago. Then a man at the next table suddenly froze. He had been laughing along with everyone else. But now his face drained of color. He looked at me, then at my father, then back at me again. His mouth opened, closed, then opened once more. "Sir," he said carefully, voice low. "I don't think you understand who she is." My father chuckled, completely unbothered. "Oh, I understand perfectly. That's my daughter. I've known her for 43 years. The man swallowed hard. "No, sir, you really don't." A few minutes later, my father would choke on his own wine so violently it sprayed across the front of his white dress shirt. The entire ballroom would fall into stunned silence. And for the first time in my life, the man who had spent decades being ashamed of me would discover that the daughter he called a failure was the very officer other soldiers trusted with their lives. But to understand how we got there, I need to take you back to the beginning. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Elena Voss. At the time of this story, I was 43 years old and had served 22 years in the United States Army. According to my father, I was the family disappointment. The wedding was being held at a luxury resort outside Austin, Texas. Late afternoon sunlight turned everything gold. White roses lined the walkways. A string quartet played beneath massive oak trees wrapped in fairy lights. It should have been beautiful. I hadn't spoken to my father in almost 2 years. Not because of one big fight, but because of hundreds of small cuts that never stopped bleeding. When I stepped out of my rental car, I saw him immediately. He stood near the entrance with a glass of bourbon, laughing with relatives. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His navy suit probably cost more than my first car. For a second, I considered turning around and driving away. Then he spotted me. His smile didn't disappear completely. It just dimmed, the way a man smiles when he's disappointed by what he sees. I walked toward him anyway. "Hi, Dad." "Elena." That was it. Just my name. Cold, efficient. Like he was checking attendance. 30 seconds later, my older brother Marcus arrived. The difference was immediate. My father grinned wide, pulled him into a hug, slapped his back, and started asking about his medical practice, his kids, his new lake house. Marcus was a surgeon. My sister Claire was a corporate attorney. Both made impressive money. Both gave my father things he could brag about at the country club. And then there was me, the daughter who joined the Army at 18, the daughter whose accomplishments came with security clearances instead of newspaper articles. To my father, military service wasn't prestigious. It was what people did when they couldn't succeed anywhere else. He had told me that more times than I could count. A wedding coordinator appeared and started gently herding guests toward the cocktail area before the ceremony. I thought I could slip away quietly into the crowd, maybe find a corner and stay invisible for the rest of the night. But my father had other plans. He stepped in front of me, wrapped one arm around my shoulders, and started guiding me forward. It wasn't a father's touch. It was strategic. the same way you'd steer a piece of furniture into place. His hand pressed firmly between my shoulder blades, pushing me toward a group of well-dressed strangers standing near a large stone fountain. "Come meet some people," he said, loud enough for the people we were walking toward to hear. "This is my youngest daughter." The groom's family turned to look at me. 10 of them at least. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, all smiling, all holding drinks, all perfectly polished. My father raised his glass like he was introducing someone important. "I'd like you all to meet Elena." For one short second, I let myself hope. Maybe he would say something decent. Maybe he'd mention that I'd been serving the country for over 2 decades. Maybe age had finally made him tired of being cruel. Then he laughed. "That's the biggest failure in this family. Don't let the uniform fool you." The laughter came fast, light, easy, the kind of laughter that happens when someone tells a joke they've told 100 times before. A woman in a lavender dress covered her mouth, trying not to smile too wide. An older man chuckled into his whiskey. They thought it was harmless family teasing. They didn't know they were watching 22 years of damage being performed in real time. My stomach tightened, but I didn't let it show. I had learned long ago how to keep my face completely still while someone tried to shrink me in public. A woman with pearl earrings tilted her head. "What does she do exactly?" My father took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "Oh, she's been bouncing around the military forever. 22 years and still doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life. Some people just never figure it out." More laughter. Softer this time, but still there. I kept smiling, the same polite, empty smile I had mastered years ago. Inside, the memories came rushing back like they always did when he started talking like this. I remembered being 13 years old, standing in the kitchen while he bragged to our neighbors about Marcus getting first place in the state science fair. I remembered being 16 and listening to him tell everyone at the dinner table how Claire had won her debate tournament. I remembered being 18, standing by the front door with my duffel bag packed, while he looked at my enlistment papers like they were evidence of a crime. "You had decent grades," he had said that day. "You could have gone to community college first, figured something out." I did figure something out, I told him. He had laughed then too. The same laugh he was using now. "No," he said. "You gave up." I had looked him in the eye that day and realized something that hurt more than any deployment ever did. He wasn't angry because I was leaving. He was angry because he was embarrassed. "The Army is for people who don't have better options," he had told me, calm and certain, like he was reading from a textbook. I picked up my bag. He didn't hug me. He didn't say goodbye. He just said, "When this doesn't work out, don't come crawling back, expecting me to fix it." That was the last real conversation we had before I left for basic training. For the next 22 years, every time I came home, the pattern stayed the same. When I made sergeant, he asked if that meant I was almost done. When I got commissioned as an officer, he said, "So now you're middle management." When I deployed, he told me to try not to do anything reckless. When I came back, he said I looked tired. Never "I'm glad you're alive," never "I'm proud of you," just "you look tired." And the worst part was that for a long time I still wanted his approval. I wanted it when I led my first platoon. I wanted it when a general shook my hand in front of my entire battalion. I wanted it so badly that I stopped telling him about promotions and awards because hearing him dismiss them hurt more than not telling him at all. Eventually, wanting something impossible becomes a form of self-harm. So I stopped wanting it. Or at least I told myself I did. The ceremony started a few minutes later. Guests moved toward rows of white chairs facing a flower-covered arch. I found my assigned seat in the very last row, far corner, almost completely hidden behind a large floral arrangement. My father had helped organize the seating chart. He always noticed who sat near power and who had to walk farther for coffee. I sat down and looked toward the front. The groom stood beside his best man beneath the arch, tall, broad-shouldered, confident. Something about the way he held himself felt familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. Then he turned slightly to speak to one of the groomsmen, and I felt the recognition hit me like a slow wave. Major Daniel Reeves. 12 years ago, he had been Captain Daniel Reeves, a young officer assigned to a task force under my command in Afghanistan. A good officer, smart, steady under pressure. The kind of leader soldiers naturally followed. I hadn't seen him since the day his unit rotated back to the States. He hadn't noticed me yet, but the realization sent a strange feeling through my chest. Because if Daniel Reeves was the groom, then there was a very good chance other military personnel would be at this wedding too. And if that happened, the night was going to become a lot more complicated than my father could possibly imagine. I settled back into my chair and waited. Across the aisle, my father laughed at something one of the groom's uncles said. He looked completely relaxed, completely confident, certain he understood exactly who his daughter was and exactly how little she had accomplished with her life. For the first time all day, I felt something close to anticipation, because my father had spent decades telling people who I was. Tonight, for the first time, he might finally hear it from someone else. The ceremony music began, and everyone stood. I stayed in my seat for half a second longer than I should have before rising with the rest of the guests. From the very back row, I watched the bride appear at the end of the long white aisle. She was beautiful in the way brides are supposed to be, soft, glowing, nervous in the best possible way. Her veil lifted gently in the warm Texas breeze as she walked between the rows of chairs. My eyes moved past her to the man waiting at the front. Major Daniel Reeves stood beneath the flower-covered arch, his jaw tight and his eyes already shining. He was trying very hard not to fall apart in front of 200 people. I knew that look. I had seen it before, 12 years earlier, on the face of a young captain who was doing everything he could to keep his men alive. He looked older now, of course. We all did. But I could still see the 28-year-old officer he had been, standing outside a command tent in Afghanistan, asking clear, steady questions while mortar fire thumped somewhere beyond the wire. He had been reliable then. He was reliable now. I felt a quiet, complicated kind of pride watching him. That was something most civilians never understood about soldiers. We carried each other in fragments. A voice over a radio, a hand gripping your sleeve in a field hospital, a laugh outside a tent at 2 a.m. when everyone was exhausted and pretending not to be afraid. Those pieces stayed with you long after the war ended. Daniel's eyes swept across the guests as the bride got closer. For a brief moment, his gaze passed over the back rows. I didn't know if he saw me. If he did, he gave no sign. I sat back down when the minister told everyone to be seated. My father was 2 rows ahead of me, sitting between Marcus and Claire, exactly where he believed he belonged. Near the front, near the important people. Every few minutes, he leaned toward one of them and whispered something that made them smile. I didn't need to hear the words to know the rhythm. My father had always been gifted at turning other people into an audience. The vows began. The bride and groom spoke about loyalty, about partnership, about choosing each other even when life got difficult. Their voices were soft but clear over the microphone. As I listened, my mind drifted again. Not to the war this time, but to the day I left home. I was 18. My duffel bag sat by the front door like a quiet accusation. My mother had been gone for 3 years by then, and the house had become a place that measured worth in achievements you could frame and hang on a wall. Marcus's medical school acceptance letter was on the refrigerator. Claire's debate trophies were displayed in the living room. My enlistment papers lay on the kitchen table like something shameful. My father stood over them with both hands on his hips. "So this is it," he said. "This is your big plan." I told him yes. He told me I was giving up. I told him the army was honorable. He told me the army was for people who didn't have better options. His voice had been calm, certain. The way people sound when they believe they're stating an obvious fact. I picked up my bag anyway. He didn't hug me, he didn't walk me to the door, he just said, "When this doesn't work out, don't come crawling back expecting me to fix it." That was the last time he spoke to me like I was still his daughter instead of a problem he didn't know how to solve. For years after that, every phone call, every holiday, every rare visit followed the same pattern. He would ask about Marcus's practice or Claire's latest case. He would ask if I was still doing that army thing. And when I tried to tell him anything real, about the soldiers I led, about the responsibility I carried, about the things I had seen and survived, he would change the subject or make a joke that landed like a dismissal. Eventually, I stopped trying. The minister's voice pulled me back to the present. The bride and groom were exchanging rings now. Daniel's hands were steady as he slid the ring onto Lila's finger, but I could see the emotion in the set of his shoulders. He had always been steady under pressure. Even now, on the happiest day of his life, that part of him hadn't changed. When they kissed and the crowd rose with applause, I stood with everyone else. Daniel lifted his new wife's hand in the air, laughing now, fully happy in a way that made something in my chest loosen for a moment. For just a second, the whole courtyard felt softer. Even my father stood and clapped like a decent man. Then the reception began, and the softness disappeared. As people started moving toward the ballroom, I stayed in my seat a little longer, watching Daniel and Lila greet their guests. He still hadn't seen me, but I knew it was only a matter of time. And when he did, I had a feeling the careful version of this night my father had constructed was going to crack wide open. I took a slow breath, stood up, and followed the crowd into the ballroom. Whatever was coming, I wasn't going to run from it. The ballroom was enormous, with crystal chandeliers hanging over round tables dressed in ivory linens. A jazz trio played near the bar while waiters moved through the room with trays of food. On one wall, a large seating chart displayed everyone's assigned tables in elegant gold lettering. I found my name near the bottom. Table 19, back corner, right beside the service entrance. Of course. My father had always believed that hierarchy mattered. Not moral hierarchy or character, but placement, status, optics. He noticed who sat near power and who had to walk farther for coffee. I almost laughed when I saw the table number. Almost. I took my seat between an elderly aunt who didn't seem to remember me and a distant cousin who immediately started complaining about his boat insurance. From across the room, my father looked back once. When our eyes met, he lifted his glass slightly. Not a welcome, just a small, deliberate reminder of where I sat and where he sat. I looked away. Dinner was served. Speeches began. The bride's father spoke first. He was warm and clumsy in a way that made people like him immediately. He talked about his daughter's kindness and how she used to cry during every Disney movie. Halfway through, his voice broke, and he didn't apologize for it. I watched him wipe his eyes with a napkin. Something inside my chest tightened. Not envy, exactly, but a quiet grief for the kind of father who could stand in front of a room and love his daughter without turning it into a performance. My father's voice cut through my thoughts a few minutes later. He had moved from his table and was now standing near the bar with several members of the groom's family. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. "My son's a surgeon," he said proudly. "My oldest daughter handles corporate litigation, very successful. And Elena..." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "She chose a different path." Someone asked a question. My father chuckled, the same low, dismissive sound I had heard my entire life. "Well, let's just say discipline was never really her strong suit." The words landed quietly, but they landed. My fork stopped above my plate. For 1 second, I wasn't in a ballroom anymore. I was 18 again, standing by the front door with a duffel bag while my father told me the army was for people who couldn't succeed anywhere else. Then a voice came from behind me. "Ma'am." I turned. A man in army dress uniform stood a few feet away. Late 30s, clean cut, strong posture. A familiar face made older by time and responsibility. His eyes widened the moment he saw me clearly. Lieutenant Colonel Voss. I stood up slowly. Major Torres. He extended his hand, but halfway through the gesture, instinct took over. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted slightly. It wasn't a full salute, not indoors, not at a wedding reception, but the respect was unmistakable, the kind of respect soldiers gave to someone who had earned it the hard way. Major Caleb Torres had served under me in Afghanistan. He had been there during some of the worst days. He knew exactly what I had done and what it had cost. Across the room, my father turned toward us. For the first time all evening, his confident smile faltered. Major Torres kept his voice low. "I didn't know you were coming, ma'am. I didn't know Dan was the groom until the ceremony started." A small smile touched his mouth. "He's a major now." "Good," I said. "That suits him." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The jazz trio continued playing something soft near the dance floor. Silverware clinked against plates. Waiters passed behind us with coffee pots, completely unaware that one quiet conversation in the back of the ballroom had just shifted the balance of the entire evening. Major Torres glanced toward the front tables. "Does Dan know you're here?" "I don't think so. He'll want to." "That can wait," I said. "It's his wedding." Torres nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he disagreed. Soldiers understood rank, but they also understood debt. The kind you carried in your bones when someone once stood between you and disaster. The kind that didn't fade just because years had passed and people had moved on with civilian life. My father's voice cut across the room again. "Elena!" Not loudly, but sharp. A command disguised as a name. I turned. He waved me over with 2 fingers, the same way you'd call a waiter. Major Torres's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's all right," I told him. He stepped aside but followed at a polite distance as I crossed the ballroom toward my father. Dad was surrounded by 5 people from the Groom's family. 2 older men, a woman in a lavender dress, and a younger couple holding champagne flutes. Their faces still carried that loose, entertained look of people who had been laughing at someone else's expense. "There she is," my father said, placing a hand against my upper back like he was presenting an exhibit. "We were just talking about you." "I heard some of it." His smile tightened. "Don't be sensitive. We're among family." The woman in lavender laughed lightly. "Your father was just telling us you're very independent." That was generous. Very independent was what polite people said after someone else had already used worse words. One of the older men looked at me. "So what do you actually do in the army?" Before I could answer, my father spoke first. "She supervises people, I think. Logistics, paperwork, something like that." Major Torres had reached us by then. He stopped just behind my right shoulder. The older man turned to him. "And you are?" "Major Caleb Torres, sir." My father brightened at the word major, as if rank only mattered when it belonged to someone else. "Oh, a major," he said. "Then maybe you can explain what Elena actually does. She's never been very clear about it." Major Torres looked at me first, a small question in his eyes. I gave the faintest nod. He turned back to my father, his voice calm but carrying weight. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Voss commanded my battalion." The group went quiet. Not completely. The room still hummed with music and laughter around us. But inside that small circle, something dropped. My father blinked. "Lieutenant Colonel?" No. Elena's not a lieutenant colonel." Major Torres didn't flinch. "She is, sir." My father's eyes moved to me. "Since when?" "Several years now." He laughed once, short, disbelieving, almost angry. "Well, the military gives out titles differently. I'm sure it sounds more important than it actually is." Major Torres didn't smile. "No, sir, it is important." My father's face darkened. You don't need to lecture me about my own daughter. I wouldn't presume to, sir. But he was presuming, and everyone standing there knew it. My father took another sip of wine, too fast this time. The glass trembled slightly in his hand. For the first time all night, he looked unsure of what to say next. And I knew the night was no longer his to control. Before my father could find another way to dismiss what Major Torres had just said, a new voice cut through the tension. "Ma'am!" We all turned. Major Daniel Reeves, the groom, stood 10 feet away. His bride, Lila, stood beside him in her white dress, glowing under the chandelier light. For a moment, Dan's face looked almost boyish with disbelief. Then he stepped forward, ignoring everyone else in the small circle. "Lieutenant Colonel Voss." He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he pulled me into a careful, respectful embrace. It wasn't casual, it wasn't familiar, it was grateful. When he stepped back, his eyes were wet. "I didn't know you were here," he said quietly. "I didn't want to interrupt your day." Dan gave a short, emotional laugh. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you saved my life. You can interrupt any day I have." The sentence landed like glass shattering on marble. My father's wine hit the wrong side of his throat. He coughed once, hard, then harder. Cabernet sprayed across the front of his white dress shirt in a sudden, dramatic red arc. The woman in the lavender dress gasped. Someone behind us whispered, "Oh my God." Dan looked confused for half a second, then his eyes moved from my father's stained shirt to the frozen expressions around us. He understood immediately that this wasn't just an awkward reunion. This was a collision between two completely different versions of the same woman. The daughter my father had spent the entire evening belittling, and the officer standing in front of him. He turned to his bride. "Lila, this is Lieutenant Colonel Elena Voss. She was my commanding officer in Afghanistan." Lila's eyes widened. Then she smiled at me with genuine warmth. "Dan told me about you," she said softly. "He didn't use your name at first. He just called you the commander who got them home." My father heard those words clearly. The commander who got them home. His lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. Dan seemed to make a decision right then. He glanced toward the stage where the microphone still stood near the wedding cake. The jazz trio was playing something soft in the background. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "would you mind if I said something?" "This is your wedding, Dan. You don't owe me anything." His smile was small and sad. "That's where you're wrong." Before I could stop him, he took Lila's hand and led her toward the stage. The band leader noticed the groom approaching and gradually faded the music. The room slowly quieted as people turned to watch, assuming another toast was coming. Glasses were lifted, chairs shifted toward the front. My father stayed beside me, stiff as a fence post. "Elena," he muttered under his breath. "What is he doing?" I don't know. But I did know one thing. Whatever was about to happen, it was no longer mine to manage for his comfort. Dan tapped the microphone once. A soft thump echoed through the ballroom. "Everyone," he said, "I promise this won't take long." A few people laughed politely. He looked at Lila, then across the guests. "Today has been the happiest day of my life. I married my best friend in front of the people we love most, and I thought I knew every important person in this room." He paused. The room leaned in. Then I found out someone was sitting quietly in the back corner. Heads turned. People started searching the tables. Dan lifted one hand and pointed directly at me. "Lieutenant Colonel Elena Voss." A complete hush fell over the ballroom. I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. I didn't move. My father shifted slightly beside me, like he wanted to step away but knew everyone would notice. Dan continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. 12 years ago, I was a captain in Afghanistan. My unit was hit during what was supposed to be a routine movement. It wasn't routine. It became the longest hour of my life. We were pinned down. We had wounded, bad information, bad terrain, not enough time. He swallowed hard. I could see his throat move. Lieutenant Colonel Voss. She wasn't a lieutenant colonel back then, but she was already the kind of leader every soldier prays is on the other end of the radio. She coordinated the extraction under fire. She moved resources people said couldn't be moved. She made decisions fast enough to save lives and careful enough not to waste them. And when it was over, every man in my vehicle came home alive. The room was completely silent. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Dan looked straight at me. I came home because of her. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened. Then Major Caleb Torres began clapping, slow, firm, deliberate. Another soldier joined him. Then an older veteran near the front stood up, then Dan's father, then Lila's mother. Within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Chairs scraped back against the floor, napkins dropped onto tables. Applause filled the room with a force that pressed against my ribs. I stayed where I was. Standing ovations are strange things when the memory behind them still hurts. People weren't clapping for glory. They were clapping because they finally understood. Beside me, my father did not clap. He couldn't. His hands hung at his sides. His stained white shirt was drying dark against his chest. His face had gone pale beneath the ballroom lights. For years, he had introduced me as less than I was. Now an entire room full of people was standing because they had learned what he never bothered to ask. Dan lifted his glass toward me. To Lieutenant Colonel Elena Voss, he said, a leader, a soldier, and the reason I'm here today. The room repeated it. To Lieutenant Colonel Elena Voss. My father flinched as if the words had physically struck him. And for the first time in my life, I watched him understand the difference between being embarrassed by me and being ashamed of himself. The applause eventually faded, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. People slowly returned to their seats, but the entire ballroom had changed. Conversations restarted carefully, in lowered voices, as if everyone had just been reminded that a person's life could be much larger and more complicated than the story told about them at a dinner table. Eyes kept drifting toward me, then quickly looking away again. I stayed standing beside my father. He hadn't moved. His hands still hung at his sides. The dark red stain on his white dress shirt had dried into an ugly, obvious mark that no jacket could fully hide. His face looked pale and strangely hollow under the bright chandelier lights. For a man who had always known exactly what to say, he suddenly seemed lost inside his own mouth. My sister Claire reached us first. She looked from my father's stained shirt to me, then toward the stage where Dan was now speaking quietly with several guests. Her expression was a complicated mix of confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been guilt. Elena, she said, her voice softer than I expected. Why didn't you ever tell us? I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because the question was so predictable. I did, I said. Multiple times. I told you I made major. I told you I had command responsibility. I told you I deployed. I told you pieces of what I could without breaking security clearances. You all just heard it as noise. Claire frowned, like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Behind her, my brother Marcus appeared. He looked down at the floor, then at my father, then back at me. Marcus had never been cruel. He was just busy, successful, and comfortable inside the family arrangement that had always favored him. He had never needed to question it because it worked beautifully for him. My father finally spoke. His voice was rough, almost hoarse. You never explained it like that. I turned to face him directly. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the old automatic need to defend myself or soften my words. No, Dad, I said quietly. You never listened like that. He had no answer. His jaw tightened out of habit, but the anger didn't fully arrive. Something else got there first. Shame, maybe, or the shock of finally seeing a mirror after avoiding one for decades. Major Caleb Torres approached with 2 other officers. They greeted me with the quiet, genuine respect soldiers gave to someone who had earned it over years, not demanded it over dinner. One of them asked my opinion on a transition program for veterans returning from deployment. Another simply shook my hand and said, "It's good to see you again, ma'am." My father watched every second of it. He watched Dan's father walk over and thank me with both of his hands wrapped around mine. He watched Lila hug me and whisper, "Thank you for bringing him home before I even knew him." That one nearly broke me. The sincerity in her voice was too much after everything that had happened. I needed air. I excused myself before emotion could turn me into a spectacle and walked out through a side door onto a stone terrace. The Texas night had cooled. Beyond the reception hall, the resort lawn stretched out under strings of warm lights. Somewhere behind me, music started again. A slow song. People were dancing now, trying to return to the normal rhythm of a wedding. I stood by the railing and breathed. For the first time all night, I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. The standing ovation, Dan's words, the look on my father's face when the entire room rose to its feet for the daughter he had called a failure. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like something much more complicated. A few minutes later, the door opened behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew his footsteps. I had heard them my entire life. Confident, purposeful, always moving toward whatever he wanted. My father stopped a few feet behind me. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sounds were the faint music from inside and the soft wind moving through the trees. Then, very quietly, he said my name. "Elena." I kept looking out at the dark lawn. I wasn't ready to turn around yet. "Yes." He took one more step closer. When he spoke again, his voice was different than I had ever heard it before. Smaller. Uncertain. I didn't know. Those 3 words could have made me angry. Years earlier, they probably would have. But anger requires energy, and I had spent too many years spending mine on a man who confused ignorance with innocence. I finally turned to face him. "You didn't ask," I said. The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. He came to stand beside me at the railing, leaving careful space between us. His wine-stained shirt was hidden now beneath his buttoned jacket, but we both knew it was still there, a permanent mark on an otherwise perfect night. "I thought—" He stopped, swallowed, and started again. "I thought you chose the army because you didn't know what else to do." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I chose it because I wanted to serve," I said. "And I stayed because I was good at it." My father's face tightened. He nodded slowly, like he was hearing the words for the first time. "I can see that now," he said. And for the first time in my life, I believed he might actually mean it. My father stood beside me on the terrace, his hands resting on the stone railing. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The music from inside drifted out through the doors. A slow, soft song that felt strangely out of place after everything that had happened. He finally broke the silence. "What hurt the most?" he asked quietly. I turned my head to look at him. His face looked older under the terrace lights, not just from age, but from something else. The weight of finally seeing things clearly after years of choosing not to. I took a breath before answering. "It wasn't that you didn't understand my job," I said. "Most civilians don't. It wasn't even that you were proud of Marcus and Claire. You should be proud of them. They worked hard." He nodded slightly, waiting. I continued, keeping my voice calm. "What hurt the most was that you needed me to be small, so your version of me would stay true. You introduced me tonight as the biggest failure in the family. You said it in front of strangers. You let them laugh. And the saddest part is, I don't think you did it because you hated me." My father's eyes stayed on the dark lawn in front of us. "I think you did it because you never learned who I became," I said. "You decided who I was when I was 18, and you never updated that picture. Every time I tried to show you something different, you looked away." He closed his eyes for a moment, When he opened them again, they were wet. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out rough and quiet. There was no performance in them, no audience, just an old man standing next to the daughter he had underestimated for most of her life. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to hear my father apologize. I thought it would feel like winning, like finally being proven right after decades of being dismissed. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like standing in front of a house that had burned down years ago and finally hearing someone admit that there had been a fire. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said again. "I was wrong." I looked at him for a long time. The man who had once told me not to come crawling back when the army didn't work out was now standing beside me with red wine dried on his shirt and tears in his eyes. "I know," I said. He waited, maybe expecting me to say more, maybe expecting forgiveness to arrive neatly, the way it does in movies. Quick, clean, and complete. But real forgiveness doesn't work like that. "I can't pretend tonight fixed everything," I told him. "Some things don't get fixed in one conversation. But if you actually want to know me now, you can start by asking real questions." He wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand, embarrassed by the tears. It was strange seeing him like this, vulnerable, uncertain, stripped of the confidence he had always worn like armor. "What should I ask?" he said. I looked back through the glass doors into the ballroom. Dan was dancing with Lila. Major Torres was laughing with another officer near the bar. Marcus and Claire stood near their table, quieter than usual, occasionally glancing toward the terrace. I turned back to my father. "Ask me what my soldiers were like," I said. His face changed, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. The tension in his jaw softened. The defensiveness that had lived in his eyes for as long as I could remember seemed to flicker and fade. "All right," he whispered. "What were they like?" And for the first time in my life, my father listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to steer the conversation back to himself or compare my life to Marcus and Claire's. He just stood there on that terrace while I told him about the young men and women I had led. I told him about the medic who sang country songs under his breath when he was scared. I told him about the driver who wrote letters to his daughter every single night, even when we were under blackout conditions. I told him about the lieutenant who grew up too fast because war doesn't care how young you are. He listened until the song inside ended. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I should have asked sooner," he said. "Yes," I answered. "You should have." There was no anger in my voice anymore, just truth. He looked down at his hands on the railing. "Do you think it's too late?" I considered the question honestly. "It's not too late to start," I said. "But it's too late to pretend the last 25 years didn't happen. You can't undo the damage with one apology. You can only decide what you're going to do from now on." My father nodded again. He didn't argue. He didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there and took it. For the first time, he was listening without preparing his next offense. Inside the ballroom, the music changed to something brighter. Laughter drifted out through the open doors. Life was continuing in there. But out here on the terrace, something else was happening. Something smaller, quieter, and much harder. Two people who had spent decades misunderstanding each other were finally standing in the same truth. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. Later that night, when it was finally time to leave, my father walked me to my car. He didn't ask for a hug. He simply stood beside me in the parking lot under the warm lights of the resort, looking more unsure of himself than I had ever seen him. The stain on his shirt was still visible even in the dim light. Neither of us mentioned it. When I opened my arms, he hesitated for a second before stepping forward. He held on carefully, like a man who was afraid of breaking something that was already cracked. His arms were stiff at first, Then they tightened. I felt him exhale against my shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. I believed he meant it. For the first time, the words didn't feel like something he was supposed to say. They felt like something he had finally seen for himself. But more importantly, I no longer needed him to say it in order to know who I was. I got into my car and drove away from the resort. The Texas night stretched out on either side of the highway, dark and quiet. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar weight in my chest when I thought about my father. It wasn't completely gone. I knew it would take more than one night to repair decades of damage, but something had shifted, something real. People can change, even the ones who have spent years hurting the people they love, but change only happens when they are finally forced to confront the truth they spent so long avoiding. Some fathers never get that moment. Mine did. Whether he continues to change, whether he keeps asking real questions and actually listens to the answers, that part is up to him now. I can't control it. I can only choose how much of my peace I'm willing to hand over to someone else's growth. As I drove, I thought about all the soldiers I had led over the years. The ones who had trusted me with their lives. The ones who had come home because of decisions I made under pressure. My father had never understood that version of me. But tonight, in front of 200 people, he had finally been forced to see it. And for the first time, he had listened. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment and tell me, do you believe people can truly change after years of hurting someone they love? Or do you think some damage is permanent, no matter what happens? And if you want more stories about family, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to stand tall when others underestimate you, make sure you subscribe. There are many more stories waiting. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Take care of yourself.